Hey everyone, this is Chad Schwartz at Lehigh Gap Nature Center. I'd like to welcome you to the Nature Center virtually. This presentation is going to take us back in time as we look at how the Lehigh Gap has changed through the years. We will start by exploring what the gap itself is and then look at how people have interacted with it over the years. And let's get started by talking a little bit about the name. So Lehigh Gap, what is the Lehigh Gap? No, it is not a gap store in the Lehigh River. Sorry, unfortunately not. We do sell clothes at the Nature Center, but we're not a Gap store. So that's not the kind of Gap we're talking about. The Gap has something to do with this Lehigh word. Lehigh, it's in Lehigh Valley. There's Lehigh University. There's Lehigh Township in Northampton County. Lehigh, what's that? Well, that all has something to do with this river that you see in the picture right here. That is the Lehigh River. It is the river that carved the Lehigh Valley, and it's also the river that carved the Lehigh Gap. So there's a hint as to what the Lehigh Gap is. So it was carved by the Lehigh River. It's not the Lehigh Valley, though. It's a little bit different. Here we go. Here's a nice picture from an airplane showing a nice overhead view of the Lehigh Gap. And this picture seems to show two mountains with the Lehigh River in between. But believe it or not, that is not two mountains. That is one mountain cut in half by the river. Okay, it's kind of like a pizza. You know, a pizza cut into 8 slices is still one pizza. This is called the Kittatinny Ridge, or the Blue Mountain, as people call it locally. It is about 250 miles long, but there are 5 places in that huge mountain where rivers cut it into pieces. Okay, so this gap was cut by the Lehigh River. That's why we call it the Lehigh Gap. But that was one solid mountain at one time, cut in half by the Lehigh River. Okay, now where's the Nature Center part come in here? Well, we happen to have about 800 or so acres of land in and around the Lehigh Gap. And a lot of that, I'll go back to this picture, is the land that is near the P on the gap there. We have a lot of the land on that side of the mountain, alongside the Lehigh River, and then going down towards Slatington. So a lot of the pictures that I'm going to show in this presentation were taken somewhere on that side of the mountain, near that P there in the word gap. So as you see the pictures, now you can kind of visualize, you can kind of picture where those photographs were taken. Okay, so that's how we get our name. A lot of people get our name wrong. A lot of people say Lehigh Nature Gap or Lehigh Valley Nature Center. We're called Lehigh Gap Nature Center because we are a nature center inside the Lehigh Gap. Okay, so now before we continue, we have to go back in time, but we need a way to get back in time. We don't have a regular time machine. Right here, we have our DeLorean time machine. This is the car from the movie Back to the Future that they used, to go back in time. But unfortunately, only I and maybe 1 or maybe 2 other people can fit in this DeLorean. So if all of us are going to go back in time, we're going to need something else. How about this magic school bus, right? This is how we take our field trip groups back in time when they visit the Nature Center. So climb in with Miss Frizzle. We're going to go back to the year 1812. Here we go, 1812. So here is the earliest picture we have of the Lehigh Gap, 1812. So there were people here at that time, not nearly as many people as there are today, but this picture is really cool because it shows us a little bit what the mountain was like back then, before the land has changed a whole lot. Okay, and as you can see on the mountain, there were a lot of trees at that time. Those were mostly pine trees, hemlock trees, things like that. But as you know, the mountain doesn't look quite like that today. We'll get to that in a little while here. But that's what it looked like back then. It was a very beautiful forested mountain. And you can see at the front of this picture here, there are some houses. There were a few farms in the area at that time, but not a ton of people. Okay. This guy right here represents a culture of people who still lived in this area in 1812. They were the people who were here for the longest period of time, and actually most of the history of the Lehigh Gap relates to these people. They are the Lenape Native Americans. They lived here for 13,000 years. That's when they first settled in this area, 13,000 years ago. Pretty amazing. They came at the end of the last ice age when there were still woolly mammoths and saber-toothed cats, giant ground sloths, dire wolves, all kinds of really cool animals like that still in existence. And those animals even lived around the Lehigh Gap, believe it or not. Back when the first Native Americans arrived, they were actually hunting woolly mammoths and bison and elk around the Lehigh Gap. Pretty cool. So a lot of the history in the Gap relates to the Native American people. And actually the highway that goes through the Lehigh Gap today, what we call Route 248, that used to be a pathway where the Native Americans would travel between the north side of the mountain and the south side of the mountain. So we still have some evidence of the Native Americans living there for thousands of years. And sometimes people will find artifacts like arrowheads and spear points and other things in the ground, even around the Lehigh Gap. Okay, so most of history relates to the Native Americans. But back in the middle of the 1700s, we had people coming from other areas of the world, mostly Germany, but also England and Wales and Ireland, places like that. Those people came over and settled in the areas around the Lehigh Gap. Okay, and this guy on the side of my screen here, that is, of course, Benjamin Franklin. And he symbolizes, he represents all those people who came from Europe and settled in this area. But Benjamin Franklin himself actually went through the Lehigh Gap. In the year 1765, he passed through the Lehigh Gap, and he even celebrated his 50th birthday around where Palmerton is located today. Now, Palmerton was not here at that time, but Benjamin Franklin was involved with building forts on the north side of the mountain. So he came through the Lehigh Gap. And lots of other people came through the Lehigh Gap over time, lots of other famous people. There's a famous bird expert named Audubon who came through the Lehigh Gap back in the 1800s. So lots of people, including some famous people, have come through the Gap. Okay, now another picture. Here we go through our Gap on the Magic School Bus. 1846. Now, was this before or after the American Civil War? This was actually still before the American Civil War. So Abraham Lincoln was alive at this time, but he was not president yet. So this is what the Gap looked like back then, even before the Civil War took place. This is a painting. The last image I showed you was a wood carving, which is basically a stamp pressed on paper. But this one's an actual painting. And what's cool about this picture is it shows us what color the Lehigh Gap was back in the middle of the 1800s. And you can see, I mentioned the forests on the mountain before, but this picture shows you just how beautiful those forests were. People came here from all over the country, and actually even from other countries, just to experience how beautiful the Lehigh Gap was. It was really a beautiful sight to see, and it drew a lot of people for that reason. Now, this picture, if you're familiar with the area, is looking toward the town of Slatington. So it was painted probably from right about where Palmerton is located today, looking down towards Slatington. And the Lehigh Gap Nature Center is on the opposite side of that river that you see in the middle of this picture. So that is the Lehigh River. The water that's closest to us is a creek that flows into the Lehigh River. But our property, Lehigh Gap Nature Center, is on the far side of this picture, right across the river from those buildings that you see at the bottom there. Okay, so of course, Lehigh Gap Nature Center was not here at that time. We didn't come along until about 2002, 2003. But this shows you what our area of the land looked like back then. Okay, let's move forward a little bit. This picture, this is another wood carving, kind of similar to the 1812 one. This shows us just how much activity there was in the Lehigh Gap by the Civil War. So this picture was made around the year 1860, right about then. And it shows you that there was a lot of different activity taking place in the Lehigh Gap at that time. So if you look in the distance, you'll see a bridge. That was called the Chain Bridge. One of the first suspension bridges in the entire world was built right there in the Lehigh Gap, made out of chains instead of cables. And you see that led onto a highway, which is now Route 248. You can kind of see a little boat there down toward the bottom of the picture. That's actually called a canal barge. That body of water that is floating on is not the river. That's a human-made body of water called the Lehigh Canal. I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a second. But you can also see there were two trains back at that time, 2 different railroads that went through the Lehigh Gap. So what were they all doing here? What was all this activity about in the Lehigh Gap? Well, it all happened to revolve around a type of rock that was mined out of the ground on the north side of the mountain. This rock is kind of black and shiny. It burns easily. It was used as fuel to power factories early in our country's history. Does anybody have any ideas what kind of rock that might have been? Of course, that rock is anthracite coal. Anthracite coal is a rock that's made out of the remains of ancient plants, ancient ferns, and things like that. And because those plants were once living creatures, not anymore, but millions of years ago, they were living creatures. Those rocks are made out of a lot of carbon, and things that have carbon in them are going to burn very well. Now, unfortunately, that produces a lot of gases that go into the air that can cause other problems. But back then, it was a very efficient fuel, very good at powering our factories, and it was a fuel that helped to build this country. Okay, so anthracite coal, that's what all this transportation was about. Now, the problem they had back then, when that coal was discovered and when they just started mining it on the north side of the mountain, is they couldn't get it down to the factories very easily. The mines were on the north side of the mountain, the factories are on the south side of the mountain. And that mountain is about 1,000 feet tall or taller in some sections. So the challenge they had back then was finding a way to get that coal from the mines up north to the factories south of the mountain. So it wasn't very easy to just dig a tunnel through the mountain at that time to carry the coal through it. It was hard to carry the coal over the mountain too because it was very tall. So what happened was the people who mined the coal realized that if they shipped it through these gaps, like the Lehigh Gap here, or the Kunkle Gap near Hamburg in Berks County, those gaps provided a natural and easy way to get the coal through the mountain. So, as a result of that, pretty much all the coal that powered every factory early in this country's history, all of that coal went through the Lehigh Gap or the Kunkle Gap. Just 2 of those 5 gaps in the Kittatinny Ridge. Okay, so the Lehigh Gap saw lots of activity, especially by the mid-1800s, like you see in this picture. All these different things were carrying coal. Now, when coal was first discovered, they tried to ship it by boat down the Lehigh River, but oftentimes those boats would end up crashing because the river was kind of unpredictable. It would be high one day, low another day. There are lots of rocks and other things that could get in their way. So most of the coal that they tried shipping down to the factories never made it. It would all get stuck in the river or would spill out, and a lot of that coal never made it where it needed to go. So in the late 1820s, they built that canal, that Lehigh Canal. People dug the entire thing by hand, and it flowed all the way along the Lehigh River, for the most part, from up in the Poconos, almost, and then all the way down toward Easton, where it met the Delaware Canal, which flowed alongside the Delaware River. So this canal connected to another one, and that canal took the coal all the way down toward Philadelphia. So that canal system was very reliable. People could actually control the water. They could control how high or low the water was because the whole thing was made by people. There were no rocks inside of it that they really had to worry about. So the only thing stopping them from shipping that coal throughout the year was wintertime, because sometimes that water would freeze, and of course they couldn't haul the coal on frozen water. So then, by the mid-1800s, the steam engine was invented, which allowed us to haul coal on trains all year long. So even when the water is frozen on the canal, these trains could still carry the coal through the gap. So as you see in this picture, there were 2 trains by the middle of the 1800s. But by the early 1900s, we actually had 4 different railroads that went through the Lehigh Gap. 4 different railroads. That was 3 different tracks, but one of the railroads shared their tracks with another company. So there were actually 4 companies hauling coal through the gap. So lots of activity here. Now, there's only 1 train track that's still active in the Lehigh Gap today. You really don't see much of the canal in that area anymore. In Walnutport and Weisport, those areas which are near the gap, you'll still see some parts of the canal that remain to this day. But the canal that went through the gap is pretty much all gone at this point. So all we really have left is 1 train track and Route 248. And not even the bridge is there anymore. We have a new bridge, actually about 100 years old at this point, that took the place of the chain bridge in the distance there. Okay, and here are some just close-up pictures of the transportation things that I just mentioned. So here's the canal system. Those canal boats are pulled by mules, and mules, of course, are half horse, half donkey. You know, to pull barges like this, they wanted an animal that had the intelligence of a horse, but the strength of a donkey in one animal. So they used mules to pull those barges. Okay, and there's a steam engine that basically put the canal system out of business because they were more efficient. They could haul a lot more coal year round. And then there's a diesel engine train, and they kind of replaced the steam engines because they were even more efficient. All right, now that building you see behind the diesel engine in that bottom picture there, off in the distance, that is the building that is actually behind me. If you see me here, that is our Osprey House Visitor Center. Our building used to be a farmhouse built in the late 1800s. So you can actually see it in a lot of these old pictures. Okay, so that is just a little bit about the industrial history, pretty much leading up to the end of the 1800s. But something really important happened in 1898. This is something that changed the entire history of the Lehigh Gap. And this is actually the reason that Lehigh Gap Nature Center exists where it does to this day. We probably wouldn't be where we are if it weren't for this New Jersey Zinc Company. So 1898, New Jersey Zinc Company moved in from New Jersey. They built this huge factory on the north side of the mountain. So if you're driving on Route 248 between Palmerton and Lehighton, you'll see a big flat area of land. Basically just has soil these days, but that big flat area of land is where this factory used to be located. Now this is one of two factories that the New Jersey Zinc Company built around the Lehigh Gap. This one was the oldest. They built another one in 1915. But they did something really cool that you might be familiar with from Minecraft. Believe it or not, they basically played Minecraft at that factory every day of the year between 1898 and 1980. When I say they played Minecraft, no, they weren't actually sitting there playing video games. They were doing Minecraft in real life. They were doing something called smelting. Okay, so basically what that means is they would mine ore from mines in New Jersey. There were some mines south of Bethlehem, and they would bring that ore to the factory, heat it up, and pull metal out of it. Now, what is ore? Ore is basically just rock that has metal locked away inside of it. In order to get that metal out of the rock, you have to heat it up to a really high temperature inside of a furnace. You know, the metal melts out, you concentrate it, and you end up with something called an ingot. Now, Minecraft, you're probably used to dealing with iron. You know, iron ore. You mine the iron ore out of the ground, you smelt that ore, you get an iron pickaxe. Well, in our case here, they weren't using iron. They were using something called zinc instead. So the word zinc that you see up on the top of the screen there, that is the metal that they were trying to extract or trying to remove from that rock. Okay, so New Jersey Zinc Company did zinc smelting. They pulled zinc metal out of rock. Same thing as Minecraft, except zinc instead of iron. Okay, so there's your furnace for Minecraft. What we're going to do now is kind of blow up that furnace a little bit, take a look inside and see what they were doing at the New Jersey Zinc Company near the Lehigh Gap. Here we go. So here is that zinc ore that they mined out of the ground in New Jersey in that area south of Bethlehem. They shipped it by train to the company, and then they put that anthracite coal inside of the furnaces. Again, that coal was really efficient. It burned at a really high temperature. It was a lot better than charcoal and some of the other types of fuels that you might be used to in Minecraft. So anthracite coal, the most efficient, highest burning source of energy that they could use inside the factory. Okay, so once you heat up your ore with that anthracite coal, you end up with, there you go, your ingot, or a zinc ingot in this case. Now, what is zinc used for? Wasn't really used to make pickaxes like the iron in Minecraft. However, incredibly useful, especially during World War I, World War II. The zinc that they had there was some of the highest quality zinc in the entire world. And it was very useful for making munitions, which went into, you know, like bombs and things during World War I, World War II. Sometimes they used the zinc for paint, especially to paint aircraft and things during the war years. But even when we weren't at war during World War I, World War II, that zinc was used for lots of other things. There's a lot of zinc inside rubber and tires. Zinc is in batteries. Zinc is in film. Zinc is in a lot of different things that we use even in our day-to-day lives, okay? So this factor was extremely important in producing high quality zinc that could be used to make lots of different things, okay? Now, here's what the Lehigh Gap looked like in 1912. So this is just shortly after that west plant of the zinc company was built. The factory that I showed you in that picture before was located on the bottom of the picture that you see here. You can kind of see some of those buildings on the side of the picture. There's a little orange square down there. I think that's part of one of the buildings. But that just gives you an idea of where the factory was located in this photograph here. Now you can kind of see Palmerton is starting to grow at that point. Palmerton did not exist before this zinc company was around. So for many years, we just had a little village there called Lehigh Gap, but that was very separate from Palmerton. So Palmerton was built by the zinc company, named after the guy who built the zinc company here, Stephen Palmer. So what you see in that picture on the left side there, kind of where the farm fields are, and you can kind of see some of those buildings painted in orange. That did not exist before the zinc company was here in the area. But what I really want you to notice in this picture here is just how many trees there were on the mountain. This is actually the first photograph I've shown you so far. I showed you some paintings, some wood carvings, but this is a photograph, or actually 3 photographs that are pasted together showing you what the mountain looked like at that time. So everything on the right side of the picture is pretty much where Lehigh Gap Nature Center is today. That is part of our 800 or so acres that we own and maintain. But look at all the trees, all the vegetation on the mountain in 1912. Now by 1950, the mountain changed a lot. This is what it looked like by 1950. Notice what's missing. So let's go back to our last picture. There you go. And here's this one. What disappeared? All those trees that I just pointed out, right? The trees were pretty much all gone by 1950. And by 2002, when Lehigh Gap Nature Center bought the property, check this out. It looked like the moon. It looked like Mars. This does not look anything like that mountain did in 1912. And there's just another picture right there. So the question is, what happened? What happened between 1912 and 1950 that caused the mountain to basically die off and turn into a moonscape? Well, it had to do with this stuff right here. All this smoke coming out of the zinc company. Now, the company did not try to harm the environment. They actually did everything they could to prevent this from happening. They used the best technology that was available when they were in operation, but they could not capture all of their smoke. They managed to capture about 99.5% of their emissions at one point, but they couldn't capture all 100%. So a lot of smoke came out of the factory, and that smoke is what ended up harming the mountain. So pollution, this is an example of pollution. Something dirty that people put into the air in this case, but it could also go into the water or the land, and it can cause harm to the environment. So that's what pollution is. Lots of air pollution in this case that ended up affecting the mountain. Now, how does air pollution, something up in the sky, affect the land though? How could something floating around above the Lehigh Gap actually end up harming the mountain? Well, let's take a closer look here. So there's that west plant of the company on the bottom there. That produced a lot of smoke. There was some pollution that affected the trees there, something called zinc oxide, which is toxic to trees. So that would, land on the ground across from the factory on the side of the mountain, and that would start to kill off some of the plants early in the company's history there. But there was something else. Here comes some other smoke. Remember earlier I said that this company built 2 factories. So the west plant, which we've been focusing on so far, but there was another factory in 1915 called the east plant that they built. And in that factory, they smelted a different kind of ore, something called sulfide ores. And sulfide ores are basically just rocks that have a lot of sulfur in them in addition to zinc. And when you burn sulfide ores, it puts a gas called sulfur dioxide into the air. That sulfur dioxide gets into the clouds, mixes with the water, and makes something called acid rain, sulfuric acid rain. Okay? So that smoke that you see in this picture, it kind of looks white in this picture, but it was more of a yellow-brown color in reality, and it smelled kind of bad. If you've ever smelled rotten eggs before, it wasn't quite like that, but it was kind of similar, a similar smell. Made your eyes water, made your throat burn. Not a very pleasant smoke. But that smoke, in addition to smelling kind of bad and making your eyes water and your throat burn, it caused all that acid rain. And that acid rain is what ended up killing off most of the trees, okay? Now, Lehigh Gap Nature Center is on something called a Superfund site. We're actually the only nature center in the entire country on a Superfund site. And what that means is a big area of land, 3,000 acres to be exact, was really seriously polluted by this acid rain and the zinc oxide and a few other things that I'll mention in a second here. That land was seriously polluted, very seriously impacted by this pollution here. So what happens is the federal government, something called the Environmental Protection Agency, they established that Superfund site, and now they're in charge of making sure it gets cleaned up the right way. So Lehigh Gap Nature Center was a really big part of cleaning up a big section of the Superfund site and working with other people in the area to show them how you can very well, clean up the Superfund site and deal with some of the pollution issues and restore some of the habitat that might have been lost. But we'll get to that in a little bit. But I wanted to point that out now because Superfund sites, those areas of land that are now being cleaned up, they all start with something like this that you see in this picture here. It all starts with smoke or something that is dumped in the ground or something like that. This is the pollution that eventually resulted in the government creating the Superfund site around Palmerton. Okay, so you have the acid rain. Now the question about acid rain though is how does acid kill plants on a mountain? So again, here's the connection between the air pollution and the mountain dying off. It had to do with this acid rain, but how does the acid actually kill the plants? Well, a lot of people think that acid rain burns plants, burns their leaves, burns their bark and things like that. And it might hurt them a little bit on the outside, but that's not really what mainly causes the plants to die. The real reason that the plants died off from the acid rain is that as the soil gets really acidic, the nutrients that those plants need start to wash away. The nutrients do what we call leach out of the soil. They wash out of the soil. And those nutrients in the ground are kind of like vitamins and minerals in our diet. The trees are still getting energy from sunlight through something called photosynthesis, but as the nutrients wash away, they lose those vitamins and minerals that they need to support their growth. Okay, so they were getting energy from the sun, but they weren't getting those nutrients from the ground that they needed to survive. So as the soil got more acidic, more and more of those nutrients washed away, the trees really couldn't survive that well anymore, and eventually they died off. Okay, then something else happened. Once you don't have trees on a mountain anymore, once there are no longer roots in the soil holding that mountain together, the soil washes away. So soil that took thousands of years to form washed away in just a few decades. And this was 1 to 2 feet of soil. A lot of soil that used to be on top of that rock, but it took thousands of years to form, and in just a few decades, it was all gone, washed into the Lehigh River, gone forever. No way to bring that soil back and put it where it was, okay? So if you didn't think that was bad enough, there were actually a few other types of pollution, as I mentioned a few minutes ago. There was zinc, of course, that settled out of that smoke onto the land, but there was also lead, cadmium, copper, other types of heavy metals that settled onto the land. And what happened then was the land got so toxic that nothing could grow back. So that's why we were left with what literally looked like the moon at Lehigh Gap Nature Center. And that wasn't just the Nature Center. That, again, was about 3,000 acres of land that became that Superfund site that we've been working on cleaning up in the years since. Now, real quick, I should mention a little bit about that zinc company. Again, I said before, they didn't try to do this. This was basically an accident, and they used the best technology they had to prevent it from happening. But unfortunately, they didn't have the same technology back then that we have today to stop all the pollution from impacting the mountain here. The zinc company was a very good company. They took incredibly good care of their employees. They made sure everybody was fairly treated. They paid their employees in cash money, which coal mining employees, they did not receive that same thing. They were paid in something called script, which is basically money they could only spend in a company-owned store. So this company, New Jersey Zinc Company, made sure their employees were really well cared for, especially compared to the coal mining companies that were not too far away from the zinc company. So these employees were very well cared for. They had good medical care. There was a hospital built by the company. The company made sure everyone was really well educated. They built a bunch of schools in the town of Palmerton. So it was a company that really cared about its employees. So, you know, despite the pollution, New Jersey Zinc Company did what they could. They were a very responsible company for that period of time. Okay, so we like to say it was a big accident. We try not to blame the zinc company too much. What we focused on over the past 20 or so years is bringing this mountain back to life and creating habitat where it was lost. So we'll talk a little bit more about that next. So what do you do with a Superfund site like this? Now, who would build a nature center there? There's no nature to be found in this picture, right? Back in 2002. Looks like a place where you'd find a Mars rover and these Martians, right, from Toy Story. Doesn't look like a place where you'd find a nature center. Who in their right mind would build a nature center there? Well, there was one person who saw some potential in the site. There's one person who had the vision to bring this land back to life and put Lehigh Gap Nature Center there. And that person happens to be inside of this spacesuit here. And no, he didn't really wear a spacesuit. This is kind of just a joke because it looked like the moon there back in 2002. But who's inside the spacesuit? This guy right here, Dan Kunkle. Okay, this is the guy who led the effort to bring this mountain back to life. He didn't do it alone, but Dan was the guy who had the vision to do this. And Dan was the guy who organized the right people to get the job done. He raised the money, he organized the volunteers, organized the experts, and brought this mountain back to life to create what Lehigh Gap Nature Center is today. Dan was the director of the Nature Center for many years. He's now on the board of directors at the Nature Center. So sometime if you're around the Nature Center, you might see Dan. He's still very much involved with everything that we do at the Nature Center. Okay, but if it weren't for Dan, Lehigh Gap Nature Center would not exist there today. So let me tell you how Dan and everybody else went about restoring the mountain, bringing it back to life, and making one section of the Superfund site a little bit nicer. Okay, so here we go. We went from Superfund to Superfund. Okay, this Superfund site was basically barren and dead from 1950 until about 2002. Now, there were other efforts to bring the Superfund site back to life. Back in the 1990s, there was a project to do that, and it worked fairly well, but it wasn't the perfect solution. So we learned from the mistakes that they made back in the 1990s and tried something a little bit different on our section of the Superfund site. Now, other people have kind of copied the method that we used to fix up other sections of the Superfund site in the Lehigh Gap. Okay? But how do you grow plants on a moonscape? How do you get things to grow there again? Well, first you got to fix the soil, okay? So we knew that we couldn't just drop seeds on the mountain and expect them to grow. We had to put a mix of something inside these tractors there. And before we planted anything across the entire mountain, we had to do a lot of experiments. You know, you can't just randomly throw things on the side of the mountain and hope that they grow. You have to figure out what works best. And the Environmental Protection Agency worked with us through this entire process because we had to follow some of the rules that they set for the Superfund site. They wanted us to do certain things. They wanted us to plant native plants on the mountain. They wanted us to stop that erosion, which was the soil washing away. They wanted us to keep those poisonous metals locked away underground. So everything we did on our property had to follow those 3 rules that the Environmental Protection Agency set. The step 1 to that was doing experiments. We had to figure out, first of all, what type of soil worked best, and second of all, what types of plants grew the best on our property. So our soil included something called compost, which is basically just broken up organic material. What is organic material? It's basically dead plants, dead animals, something like that. You might have a compost bin at home where you throw banana peels and orange peels and things like that, or some of your food that you don't finish at dinner, you throw it out in a compost pile, it turns into soil. So compost is very nutrient-rich soil, holds onto water really well. we ended up figuring out that mushroom compost from mushroom farms worked the best on the Superfund site. So that's what we ended up using. We also put fertilizer in the mix, which provides nutrients for the seeds that we planted. In lime, what is lime? Not the fruit, not the things like lemons. In this case, it's a crushed rock, crushed limestone. Limestone helps to bring the acidity of the soil down. Our soil was super duper acidic from all that acid rain that built up over the years. So we had to address that problem by putting limestone down. We put 4 tons of crushed limestone on each acre of the mountainside. Then we planted super grasses. So these weren't just your standard grasses that you have maybe in your backyard or home. These are a little bit different. These grow sometimes taller than me. You know, these could be over 5, 6 feet tall in some cases. They have roots that go deep under the ground, sometimes 10 feet below the surface of the earth, almost as deep as the deep end of a swimming pool sometimes. And they lock the metals away underground very well. So what's cool about these grasses that we planted is they don't just provide habitat for animals. They don't just provide a home for animals to live in and food in the form of seeds and things like that. They also help to solve some of those problems that we had on our property. They help to address those rules that the Environmental Protection Agency set for us. So they're all native plants, which means they've been in this area for thousands of years. They have those deep roots that hold the mountain together really well, and they lock those metals away under the ground. And on top of that, they're building fresh, clean topsoil above those metals where other plants can someday grow, okay? So these grasses help to solve a lot of the problems that we had at Lehigh Gap Nature Center. We were told none of this would ever work. Even the experts didn't think anything could grow there again. But pretty much right away, these grasses started to grow. And take a look at this. Here's a picture I showed you earlier back in 2002. Just 2 years later, the mountain looked like this right here, that same section of mountain. So it turns out that these grasses grew really well in the Lehigh Gap. And we based this on nature, actually. We looked at what conditions were similar to our property, and we realized that post-glacial Pennsylvania, which is what Pennsylvania was like after the glaciers started to move up, that was an environment very similar to what we started with. It was very rocky, very dry. And guess what grew there? Grasses like these. Then there's this area in southeastern Pennsylvania where there's a lot of metal in the soil, but naturally. It wasn't put there by people. And what grows down there in that area of Pennsylvania? Grasses like these. So we figured if these grasses grew in Pennsylvania after the glaciers left, if these grasses grow today in that area of Pennsylvania where there are a lot of metals in the soil, we thought they would probably do well on our property. And check it out. It worked out even better than we expected. Way better than even the experts expected. That blue mountain turned green very quickly. Okay, so here are just a few more pictures, 2002, and there's just a year later. Here's another year later, 2004. Here's another comparison, 2003 versus 2002. There you go, wildlife return, just a dog. Okay, and we created this thriving grassland ecosystem in just 2 years. So it didn't take long to reestablish a habitat where it had been gone for decades at that point. Pretty amazing. So this is basically what the Lehigh Gap Nature Center looks like today if you hike our trails. Summertime, these grasses get really tall. By late summer, they're at their full height, which is, like I said, sometimes 5 to 6 feet tall. And they even change colors, sometimes like the trees do around here. Really a pretty place to hike in the fall. So check out this grassland on our trails. Lots of wildlife there, lots of cool things to see. Okay, now here's another challenge that we had. We had to figure out how to plant grass seeds on top of a mountain. So as you saw earlier, we had tractors with these big spreaders that would spread the grass seed and soil on the lower parts of the mountain. But how do you get grasses to grow way up there? Couldn't drive the tractors up there, it was too steep. Couldn't carry the seed up by hand. That was a lot of work. So we used technology. We used, here it is, airplanes, crop duster airplanes. These are usually used to spray things around farms, sometimes not so great things, unfortunately. But in our case, we use those airplanes to spread seed to get that upper part of the mountain to grow back. Here's a picture from 2006, right after we started doing that. You can see how that's starting to grow back. 2007 and 2008. So this is very much what the Nature Center looks like today. This is a full picture of our refuge. You can see there are grasses up on the steep slopes of the mountain. Grass is closer to us on the lower slopes of the mountain here. And we're not done. We're still working on planting things on the refuge. We're still studying the grassland, trying to see how it changes over time. We are planting some types of trees on the property too, but we have to be careful what kinds we plant because some trees pull those metals out of the ground. Things can eat them then. So we want to be careful about what we plant exactly in the gap. Well, this is basically what it looks like today. Okay, so wildlife returned, as you can imagine. As soon as we put habitat back on the mountain, as soon as we put homes back on the mountain for those animals to live in, all kinds of things return. So now we have birds like that scarlet tanager that you see on the picture there, that bright red bird. We have turtles in our ponds and in the river. There are monarch butterflies and all kinds of other wildlife that has come back to this area since we brought the mountain back to life. We even see otters every now and then in the river. Not too common yet, but they're back, and bald eagles. So not only has the land recovered nicely, not only has the land come back to life, the river has come back to life too. That was just as polluted as the mountain was at one time. So it's great to see all these wildlife. Wildlife are good indicators of how healthy or unhealthy the environment is. They tell us if things are not in great shape. And for many years, these creatures did not live around here. So now that they're back, we know that we have created a nice thriving ecosystem, a nice thriving habitat on the mountain again. Well, that's all we have for today's virtual lesson. If you have any questions, feel free to contact us, and hopefully you can stop by and check it out for yourself sometime. Okay, take care, everyone.